please welcome Nadine Smith.
All right. Hello. Hello, everybody. It's true, they put me through my paces to test my nerd savvy. Thank you for being here. Thank you for, I'm going to do this. There we go. Thank you for being here, because we're here to talk about, the volatile world we're living in, authoritarianism, and you could be playing, poker right now instead. So I appreciate you making time. And also, I know one of the things that a lot of people have been asking me these days has been, what do we do when we don't live in Florida? Well, first of all, they always look at me with sad eyes when I tell them I'm from Florida, which we call frontline Florida. And part of the reason we call it frontline Florida is we want to deliver the message that while so much of the fight, all of these bad things that are happening in our state, Florida is the front line, but it is a national fight for who we are as a country. So it really means a lot to have JoCo, standing with us, bringing resources to the front line. The auction will benefit Equality Florida. So I want to take you through how we got here, where we are, and where we're heading. And it is important to remember that even though the work of Equality Florida is very specifically focused on LGBTQ issues, it is not singularly focused, because we understand that when these authoritarian movements grow and build, they have a similar worldview. They are always attended by racism. They are always attended by the reduction of access to abortion and reproductive rights and bodily autonomy. It always includes the attack on the LGBTQ community and sex panic. And it always includes the attack on people based on disability. It always appeals to an ideology of superiority. And it invites people to join its movement by offering them the possibility of joining the superior side of the conflict. So you have people that you think, why on earth would that person vote against their own interests? They vote against their own interests on the promise of the possibility of being invited in to the superior side of the conflict. And so I just want to take you back. In 2015, when Donald Trump was rumored to be running for president, it was pretty much a foregone conclusion, but he hadn't taken the ride down the escalator to make his announcement. He was still pretty much a punchline on late night television. And I had been enrolled in something called Leadership Florida, which was, they bring together, it was mostly sort of business people and politicians, and for years and years and years, it had been a very conservative entity. But over time, a few people had gotten in, and they had cracked the door open for us nonprofit progressive types to sneak in through a side door. So there I was during my class, and we were having, I think it was the very last convening, and we were in Miami, and we were at a hotel, and the speaker who was coming up was a professor of demographics from the University of North Carolina. I'm as bored as you are of me setting up this story. That's how bored I was in the room. I just thought, I'm going to play Words with Friends in the back and try not to be rude, because I don't really care about demographic trends and shifts and how it impacts the consumer, whatever. And then he went to the podium, and he was an older black gentleman, very distinguished, and his opening sentence was basically, America is in the midst of a demographic convulsion that is about to upend every aspect of our society, politically, culturally, and economically. And he said it is the collision between the graying of America, which is overwhelmingly white, and the browning of America, which means the demographic shift that is emerging means there will be no racial majority in our country. We will truly be the salad, the melting pot, whichever metaphor you prefer. And he said, and because of that, we are about to experience in this country an upheaval that we have not seen for decades. And I remember, he talked about, for example, that Trump was the culmination of a lot of the sowing of seeds of all of this. Like, it wasn't an accident that people who did not like the fact that Barack Obama was president didn't simply disagree with his policies. They challenged his citizenship. And in doing so, what they were really saying is there is an identity that is American, and it has a certain look, it has a certain skin color, it has a certain religion. And they were instilling this idea. And so, at the same time that we often think of progress as linear, it rarely is. We can make progress on one track while losing ground on another. We were seeing an incredible response to the country when George Floyd was murdered. You saw people who ordinarily did not show up for protests showing up, filling the streets. You saw corporations that didn't generally speak up on race issues doing so, sometimes problematically, sometimes awkwardly, but at least entering the arena. And it felt like our nation was on the verge of perhaps some final reckoning with our past and the legacy of our past. But at the same time as we saw that progress, we were also seeing this backlash. We were also seeing the people who were furious were building their infrastructure backed by an entire network of billionaires. The same folks who were behind Brexit and backing Trump and pushing anti-LGBT laws in Ghana, that same cohort were at work here in the States. I guess I can't say that right now. So I think it's really important to understand how the attacks on the LGBTQ community have always, in authoritarian takeovers, been a part of the strategy to create a panic, and to do it by the supposition that the existence of the LGBTQ community is in and of itself a danger to young people. And so what did they do? They created a group called Moms for Liberty. Oh, Mommies for Liberty. Just got together. Some really concerned moms were clutching their pearls one day, watching, discovering that little Jane had brought home a book of pornography from the elementary school library. And they were so gosh darn upset that they formed a group and, slowly but surely began to go to the school districts, which is the story they are telling you. And it's complete bunk from the very beginning. It's a complete lie. Moms for Liberty was founded by the wife of the former chair of the Florida Republican Party while he was chair, after he had complained publicly and repeatedly that the Republican Party was losing suburban moms, which is political speak for white women, especially after George Floyd's murder, and that they needed something that would basically send those suburban moms into a lizard brain panic, which they could weaponize and manipulate. So, Moms for Liberty popped up. They would make you think that they were just, funded by bake sales, and they were infused with funding. They've tried their best to hide their funders. But if you look at the January 6th, the folks that bankroll January 6th, and you looked at the folks who bankroll Moms for Liberty, you'll see some overlap there. Grassroots organizations don't come out the gate with nearly $2 million to get going. Now, if I tell you the name of the founder, the official founder of Moms for Liberty, her name might be familiar to you. It's Bridget Ziegler. And she and her husband, Christian Ziegler, made the news for something very different than Moms for Liberty. They made the news because they were facing allegations of sexual violence because they were, a woman reported Bridget Ziegler's husband accused him of rape because they were in a three-way relationship. And what was interesting in that moment this is one of the things that gives me hope for the future. Young people who went to the school board, I left out the fact that Bridget Ziegler's on the school board for Sarasota School District. And so the very first school board meeting after this scandal broke, people went to the school board to call for her resignation. And what impressed me more than anything were young people going to the podium who said, we don't care whether you're in a three-way relationship. We want you gone because you're a bad school board member who does harm to us and our families. And that, you know, people were saying the hypocrisy isn't that you and your wife like to pick up a third. Although there was a disturbing post that emerged as a consequence of the investigation. And I haven't posted a whole lot about that scandal because I agree, we don't care about your sex life. In fact, the whole point is that it's none of our business. If it's a crime, it's our business. Even the hypocrisy of it, in many ways, is none of our business. The hypocrisy isn't that you were involved in, that your private life does not match your public rhetoric. The hypocrisy was that you pretended to be, from the very beginning, something you never were. Moms for Liberty didn't even have kids in the schools that they were going to and demanding that books be taken off the shelves. And they tried to wrap it in this rhetoric of, we're here to protect the children. Not their children. They're here to tell my kid what he can and can't read in the schools. But really, the entire purpose was to create in people's minds a distrust of teachers, a distrust of school districts, and that they alone provided the answers. And when you wrap things up in a fear that children are being harmed, then reason goes out the window. When you wrap things up in the idea that children are in danger, you have people showing up at a pizza place in Washington, D.C. to liberate children being sex trafficked out of the pizza place's basement. And you go, how on earth did we get into a world that has gone absolutely mad? But they count on striking whatever fear will take you out of your right mind, will allow them to control you. And when I tell people that the reason that these attacks, especially against the trans community, especially focused on schools, is absolutely manufactured, I can literally point to who launched it. Because they are so brazen at this point that they will tell you exactly how it happened. So I'm quoted in a New York Times article, and the only reason I say that is because what I said there was brilliant. But the reason I say that is you'll remember to look up my name and New York Times, and you'll find this article. Because in the same article, a right-wing think tank, basically they said, marriage equality stopped being a useful wedge issue for us. It had gained too much support across all demographics, and we had to find something new that we could whip people into a hysteria about. And they said we threw everything against the wall, and what stuck was people didn't know much about trans people, and they especially didn't know much about trans kids. And we knew we could work with that. And within a year of that process, all across the country, and especially in Florida, you began to see legislation introduced that went after trans athletes, and then after health care for trans kids, and then after health care for trans adults. You began to hear the words gender ideology. You began to see the systematic stripping of access to bathrooms. All of these emerged from a think tank telling the far right, this is what you need to do to create a moral panic that will cause people to give you the power to take these rights away. So no matter what part of the authoritarian cycle, what part of the globe you are in, if you want to know what laws are going to be introduced in Florida by DeSantis, all you had to do was look at what laws were introduced by Putin in Russia. There is a one-to-one correlation between them. So it's really important that we understand how all of these are tied together. Because at the same time that they were talking about gender ideology and going after any book that had any representation of the LGBTQ community, including a book about two male penguins, the true story of two male penguins raising an orphaned penguin chick in a New York library, was deemed pornographic. And so they systematically took down all the anti-bullying programs, took them off the website, removed books from libraries, books from classrooms, and they created an atmosphere of so much fear that principals and superintendents were giving orders that went beyond the scope of even the corrupt letter of the law. They were telling teachers, you can't have your partner, your spouse's picture on the desk. You can't have a safe space sticker on your door in your classroom. You can't wear any rainbow-colored pin that might indicate that you're a safe person for a child to turn to. Even though all of the research tells us that having just one person in your life as a youth who is supportive of you is quite literally a lifeline. So when we talk about all of what we have been experiencing, it is a horrific backlash to significant progress around race, around gender, around sexual orientation. So the bad news is we've been seeing wave after wave in Florida. Perhaps more than any other place, we have the perfect storm of Trump in Mar-a-Lago and Ron DeSantis paving the way for his own run for presidency, which he believed he had to outflank Trump to the right to compete and usurp him for the MAGA base. So all of that has meant the front line has been Florida. The most important battles are unfolding there. And that's the bad news. Let me tell you where we are right now. This last legislative session quite literally ended on Friday. We entered that legislative session with 22 anti-LGBTQ bills having been introduced. I feel like the earth just moved, yeah. It was daunting. We used to just have 2 days of lobbying, grassroots lobbying, inviting people to Tallahassee. Since this attack, every single day has been Pride at the Capitol. Every single day, different groups of people have come to the Capitol to testify, to speak, to hold rallies, to speak out, and to hold people accountable. When session ended, 21 of those 22 bills had either been defeated or neutralized completely. Yes. And it is important to realize, especially in the face of tremendous odds, when you're up against the kind of people that will use every hateful piece of rhetoric to dehumanize, to inspire violence, and we do see a spike in hate crimes. We have had to take our staff through safety trainings. We've had to give people access to surveillance equipment for their homes because of the targeting. Because Moms for Liberty doesn't show up by themselves. They show up with the neo-Nazi group, the Proud Boys, with masks on, shirts emblazoned with AR-15s. They create a gauntlet that parents and kids had to walk through to go to a school board meeting to testify against Moms for Liberty. That's how it started. Right now, we're outnumbering Moms for Liberty in school district after school district, even in some of the most conservative places in our states, because real parents are actually showing up and saying, Moms for Liberty doesn't speak for us. They don't even go here, right? And it has turned the tide, absolutely. And I think this is the thing that is so important for us to understand when we experience these authoritarian takeovers. Someone famously said that fascism came to Chile precisely because we did not think it was possible for fascism to come to Chile. the assumption that we are hardwired for democracy and that these things are aberrations instead of asymmetrical warfare, that we have to wake up and understand that these things aren't just happening randomly. There is a strategically funded effort of disinformation, of stripping our democracy out from under us, of voter suppression, of creating an environment where we fear each other instead of look out for each other. Now, it is satisfying to begin to win. There's a professor at Boston University named Stephen Prothero, and he's written about the function of backlash. And he said, by the time a backlash arrives, it is actually a lagging indicator that the pendulum has tipped. By the time they realize the culture has shifted, by the time they come after you, it is an admission that the culture has already tipped away from the world they're trying to drag us back to. And we saw this around marriage equality. And with marriage equality, there was no national organization that said, let's go get marriage. In fact, a lot of the national organizations said, don't do it. America's not ready for it, and if you go for it, you're going to upset the apple cart on the things that are reachable, like workplace non-discrimination or housing non-discrimination or some of these basic things that we were beginning to get majority support around. Marriage equality became the fight for two reasons. Individual couples wanted to get married and were starting to sue for the right. But the other reason, and I would say the fastest catalyst to marriage equality, was the fact that the far right decided to go state after state and close the door to marriage equality. 38 states in a row, they won at the ballot box, including in Florida in 2008. But a really strange thing happened in the immediate aftermath of that loss. We were looking at polling numbers, and we were seeing support for our side increase, like at a rate we'd never seen before. It's what prompted us a year and a half later to go after marriage equality, even though people said there's no way you're going to get that before the Supreme Court if it ever decides. We'll give that to you. We got marriage equality in Florida before the Supreme Court made it the law of the land. And we did it because we saw this turning of the tide. We understood that their attack on us had actually been the catalyst for organizing at a whole new level. That we were suddenly talking to people about our lives and about the ability to take care of the people we loved, the ability to take care of our kids. We stopped talking in antiseptic terms about the rights that, you know, the General Accounting Office bestows immediately upon being married, or whatever clinical way that people had been fighting for marriage equality. We started just telling love stories and talking about taking care of the people we loved. And the tide began to turn. And right now, in school district after school district, you have teachers standing up and fighting for those kids. You have parents showing up and saying, we don't trust these so-called moms for liberty. We trust the teachers, we trust our school districts, and we trust ourselves. And if there's a book I don't want my kid to read, I'll decide that, not you. And so we see this tide turning because people are showing up and they're speaking up. There's a lot of folks who've canceled conferences in Florida because they can't guarantee that all of their members can come to that place and be safe and not be challenged going to a restroom or confronted or have access to medication or be treated with dignity and respect if they have an emergency and have to go to a hospital. And so at first, the governor was like, oh, you know, Florida, we're doing fine. Tourists are coming here no matter what. Well, we were benefiting from that backlog of folks who had their travel delayed because of COVID. We were feeling really good, and right now, the latest numbers that came out is Florida's had 2 million less visitors in the aftermath of this relentless passage of cruel legislation that has people, when they think of Florida, thinking more about book bans than beaches. We were going to be repairing the damage that has been inflicted by this governor long after he is out of office. And one of the things that was really important to us was that we define our governor on the national stage. He even changed law. You used to have to resign to run for president, but he changed that law and insisted now that he could remain governor and run for president And suddenly Florida taxpayer dollars are being used for political stunts, kidnapping immigrants from Texas and flying them to New York on Florida taxpayer dollars. So it is a perilous time for democracy, and it's an important time for us to fully gauge who we are up against, how well funded they are, how very specific they are in their goal. We knew that they would go after progress on race, and they've done it by calling anything that speaks honestly about racial history in our schools as critical race theory that's indoctrinating young people. They've talked about anything that simply includes the representation of LGBTQ people as gender ideology and dangerous indoctrination of young people. They have gone after books. Florida rejected, I think it was 46% of textbooks, saying that they were just riven with critical race theory. And when they were forced to give an example, one reporter discovered that they had rejected a math book because in the math book it included a blurb identifying Katherine Vaughn Johnson, one of the women featured in Hidden Figures, as the first black woman to head a department at NASA. And to them, that was racist indoctrination that would make white students uncomfortable. So we have a great deal of work, but we see that the tide is turning. It's not just that we stop these this terrible legislation. The courts are speaking out. The so-called Stop Woke Act was found to be unconstitutional 4 or 5 days ago. Absolutely. But I want people to understand that while it is happening in Florida, I guarantee it's happening wherever you are, anywhere in the world. This idea of creating in the minds of people an absolute moral panic. And the function of a moral panic is to take you out of your right mind. I'll just give you this one example of how dangerous it is when we give ourselves over to fear. And it is where they want us to be at all times. Be afraid of immigrants. Be afraid of anybody who is different than you. Be afraid of anybody who worships differently than you or doesn't worship at all. Fear is what they are selling, because in fear you will give away everything to feel safe. So I was in my front driveway, because when I speak, I like to pace. That's why I hate Zoom, because I need to be moving around. And I had my headphones on, had my phone in my hand. I was having a very animated conversation, and the sun was coming down, and I glanced up the road, and I saw this person walking towards me. And I should say sort of staggering towards me, just kind of. And I thought, oh my gosh, what is going on? I'm still talking, but now I'm clocking this person. And as I get a little bit closer, to my horror, I realize they have a gun in their hand. Just like this, just staggering down the road, gun in their hand. And as I get a little bit closer, I realize they're muttering to themselves. And it's a woman, staggering, gun in hand, muttering to herself. And in that nanosecond that I'm taking this in, I think to myself, oh my God, she's killed her whole family. She snapped, she's killed her whole family, and now she's walking towards me. What do I do? Now she's getting close enough, and I'm looking at her, and she can see that I'm looking at her, and now she's locked onto me, and I'm thinking, okay, I should go in the house. No, I'll draw her towards my family. I should run, right? And then finally this feeling came over me that just said, calm down. Calm down. And I did. And as she got a little bit closer, I realized she didn't have a gun in her hand. She had her cell phone by her side. She wasn't muttering to herself. She was talking on the phone just like I was. She had headphones on. And she wasn't staggering. She was just close enough to the edge of the road that, kind of sloped down. So she was just rocking a little bit as she walked. And the reason she was staring at me with what I perceived to be a mean look was because that's how I was looking at her. Now, we're in an open carry state. If I had allowed my fear to grip me in that moment, if either one of us had introduced a weapon into that circumstance, one of us might not be here. It is what fear does to us. It is how it causes us to interpret everything we see as a menace, as a threat. And it's the importance of us taking that moment to say, calm down. Because the real threats don't really show up like that. They show up in legislation that erodes our democracy, erodes our rights, takes away our freedoms, and calls it liberty. It's the hollowing out of these words that are supposed to mean something. Now, my wife loves to read these big history books, medieval, she knows so much about the Ukraine, and, she tries to read them to me, and I let her read them to me as long as she knows that I might fall asleep. But at some level, this has penetrated my psyche because she talks a lot about parallel polis. Folks know that term? It's really what you've created here, and it's the importance of this. It's the importance of science fiction. It's about creating the world as we wish it to be, as opposed to how it is. It's about creating a world where you get to be your authentic self, where you create your own economy, where you create your own way of living and being, because liberty is about the ability to live freely, to live authentically, to pursue happiness without being imposed upon. And in this place, there was a place called the Maidan in Ukraine. See, I told you, I absorbed more than I knew, but they'd created such a beautiful space, so different than the authoritarian regime that surrounded them, that people began to fight to defend what they had created. And at first it was young people, and they thought if they put more pressure on those young people, if they could just inflict enough pain on those young people, that the parents would come and take those kids home and say, enough, this is too much. But instead what happened was the parents joined those young people in the Maidan. And the idea that was sparked there became the North Star they began to fight for. So I was talking about this last night with a few folks, and they said, well, this is what it feels like. This is why we would call the crow's nest 10 forward, because that's sort of what the Federation was for us. The Star Trek world was the place we could visit where we were beyond. We didn't ignore division, we embraced it. We didn't ignore unique cultures, we learned from them. It is a beautiful thing. It is a necessary thing in the face of authoritarianism to understand the machinery at work, to understand the connection between the attacks on all of the different aspects of our identity, whether it is our race, our gender, our sexual orientation, our level of ability or disability, our faith. All of these things work together to inspire in us so much fear that we will turn on each other, and instead of holding on to those spaces worth protecting, those ideas worth protecting, we get fearful, we crouch and we hide. So we came up with these shirts that said resist, because it is not futile, it is necessary, and it is effective. Non-cooperation with evil is our prime directive. And in doing so, we have eroded their ability to control us. So I want to leave you with something that I'm sure some folks here will recognize, but I think it was one of the most powerful distillations of the work that we have to do, no matter what the odds seem. Because not only do we see a turning point in Florida where we're not just fighting back, we're gaining new ground. We're not just clawing back what they took, but we are bigger and stronger than we were before the fight began, because we had to be to survive. And we are prepared for what Professor Prothro talked about when he talked about backlash. He said backlash is often the prelude to incredible advancement. And you have to think of it as a slingshot. They are pulling us backwards and thinking they are taking things away, but they're actually creating the dynamic tension necessary that when we break their grip, we won't just bring back to where we were when the attack and backlash began, we will propel forward into a future beyond our imagination. And we've got to begin to prepare ourselves for that breakthrough moment, even as we defend ourselves against this attack. And I don't use this slingshot analogy to minimize the harm that they're doing in the meantime. They're literally costing lives with their anti-science, anti-democracy ideology that is stripping away needed protections. But it is important. Hope is not something that we cling to. Hope is a discipline that we hone because it is a necessary part of the equation to break authoritarianism. And I think about Andor, and I think about Nemec's manifesto. And so for those who do not follow Andor and have not heard Nemec's manifesto, I will read it to you very briefly because I think about this almost every day. He said, "There will be times when the struggle seems impossible. I know this already. Alone, unsure, dwarfed by the scale of the enemy. Remember this. Freedom is a pure idea. It occurs spontaneously and without instruction. Random acts of insurrection are occurring constantly throughout the galaxy. There are whole armies, battalions that have no idea that they've already enlisted in the cause. Remember that the frontier of the rebellion is everywhere, and even the smallest act of insurrection pushes our lines forward. And remember this, the imperial need for control is so desperate because it is so unnatural. Tyranny requires constant effort. It breaks, it leaks. Authority is brittle. Oppression is the mask of fear. Remember that. And know this, the day will come when all these skirmishes and battles, these moments of defiance will have flooded the banks of the empire's authority. And then there will be one too many. One single thing will break the siege. Remember this, try. Thank you. All right? Okay. So, any questions? And there has to be at least 3, otherwise it gets really awkward. And I see somebody making their way to the microphones that are on either side of the stage. But if you need someone to bring the microphone to you, just wave your hand and Dallas will get you a microphone.
Hi, my name's Leslie, and I live in Gainesville, Florida.
Right on.
Which, for most people, it's that blue island in the middle of the state. It's very progressive. I am also a county employee, so I cannot in any way be recorded or represent that, A, I'm a county employee and I have political opinions. So what do I do to help?
Well, I will be just as direct as you have been. Send money where you can. If you can't show up, you can be an activist online where your identity can be whatever you want it to be. Let your avatar speak in the places where your identity cannot. And you can also recruit people around you. You can ask people to show up in spaces. You can hold a house party with your friends. But no matter where you are, it has been great. The folks at Equality Illinois held a fundraiser for Equality Florida. Folks in New York are planning one right now, and in April we're going to have one in Los Angeles because people understand that this is their fight. And so as you can imagine, there's a lot of state employees that are particularly nervous during legislative session about how they show up and where they show up. But they find a way, and buy a shirt. They can't take away your entire freedom of expression. And there are 1,000 ways to make your voice heard. Become a member of Equality Florida, equalityflorida.org. You don't have to be a Floridian to be a part of the resistance. Thank you. Go Gators. Oh.
Congratulations on your legislative session. I'm from Idaho, which was one of the first states to start to pass this round of anti-trans legislation. And because I'm from there, I know that organizers really fought it, and they had some victories and some losses. But whenever I read about Idaho or Florida in the national news, you see people talking about those places, and it makes me so sad that you can see people thinking, oh, I'm just never going to go to that place. That's a bad place. I'm putting it on my bad list. And they don't really see the fight that's happening there, and they don't feel like they can connect with that fight. I think people really do feel like the best thing they could do is say, this place is bad. So having seen all the successes you've had locally, and I do political organizing myself with people with disabilities, how do we communicate to a national audience that you can do more than just dismissing a place? How do we communicate to a national audience that there's a fight going on, there's wins and there's losses, but you can do more than just dismissing these places?
Yeah, it is a tricky thing. I will tell you, we issued a travel advisory for Florida, in part because our phone lines, our emails, our DMs were flooded with people going, hey, can my son come home during spring break with assurances that he can get access to medical care? Or if I use the restroom in the airport, do I risk arrest? All of these kinds of things. And so we said our travel advisory wasn't a boycott of the state. We simply said, we're going to outline all of the things you need to know about how these laws can affect you. And we are not the ones to make the decision about whether you should come or not come. Dwayne Wade, in leaving Florida, said it was not a safe space for his trans daughter, right? Now, if you would ask me, is Florida a safe space for a millionaire star athlete married to a famous, film star with the resources they have at their disposal? If they ask me, should I stay or leave, how could I make that determination? But my wife and I, we're staying with our child in Florida. We're there to fight. Now, the decision we make and the decision other people make, everybody's got to factor different criteria. We've had to say goodbye to some really good people because they weren't certain that their kids would get what they need. And there are conferences that have canceled because, has anybody been arrested for using the restroom that is different than the gender assigned at birth? Not so far. But I know that every time we're in the Capitol and our people are there to testify, they have Capitol Police stationed outside the restrooms to intimidate people. So I guess what I'm saying to you is I've had lots of conversations with groups saying, should we come or not come? And my response is always the same. I can't answer that for you. If you decide not to come, you've got to make a lot of noise about why you didn't come. And if you decide to come, you got to make a lot of noise about your disagreement with these policies, and you got to leave resources behind. And for the most part, the companies, the conferences that have communicated with us have done one or the other. They've made a public announcement about why they're choosing not to come, and they are sending resources to the front line, or they're saying we're here, and we're here to be boots on the ground for the resistance, and we're going to financially support those fights. So I feel you. There's a tension and a struggle, but we are doing our best to say, do not abandon Florida. Either come and join the fight or send resources to us if you're not willing to put resources into the state economy.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi.
Hey there.
I'm number 3, so it won't be awkward.
Okay, great.
I came out a year and a half ago after kind of fearing just and seeing the world and all the news about how bad and terrible it was. And now I feel my eyes are drawn towards that even more. How do I and individuals keep aware of the individual stories of bullying and attacks without just being overcome by staring into the void and just losing hope?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, one of the things that is part of American culture that makes resistance difficult is this very independent, the national culture is independent, right? Even when we talk about work-life balance, hey, get that in balance, all right? As opposed to recognizing that it's not just individual. We live in what we understand, and I think the LGBTQ community in particular understands, is that we have to build community. We have to create support networks, right? So you don't have to carry the baton at all times, but you do have to carry your leg of the race, right? So to me, it is about cultivating in advance. I run plays in my head. So for example, I do a lot of traveling, and I would get on planes, and I would have to decide in the moment if somebody says, so what do you do? And it's like, oh, I'm flying from Tampa to California. Do I really want to, like I've got to size up whether this person's going to be cool or a jerk. But what I said to myself is I will always come out no matter what, because the closet is a very sneaky thing. Like I can say I work for a nonprofit. I work for a nonprofit called Equality Florida, or I can say I work for the statewide LGBTQ education and advocacy organization, Equality Florida, because I want to break these habits that I have in my head about the closet. Because I lived way too many years in the closet, right? So what I'm saying to you is you might say, I will always interrupt bigotry. If I hear somebody bullying somebody, I will at least be the one voice in that room that says, hey man, knock it off. Leave them alone. Or I will always be somebody who responds in these sets of circumstances. And I don't know what that is for you, but it's not that we have to show up all the time, every time, because sometimes it's not physically safe. Sometimes if I'm not balanced, I can escalate a situation. But I run plays because I want to build the muscle memory of how to show up for the people in my community. And so we have a slogan that we use, joy is resilience. Like having fun in a world that tells you that you're not supposed to exist is a powerful thing. And so we make sure that we build in the fun in this work so that we can handle it when we hit the hard times. But don't think that activism is a relentlessly dour process of constant fighting. It is building your community to look out for each other. Our motto in our safety trainings is who keeps us safe, we keep us safe. And so expanding who that we is and that sense of accountability to each other, that we look out for each other. And I feel that everywhere on this boat. I feel people, even with the little love notes left all over the place anonymously, it's just about building the ties that bind, that cause us to look out for each other in those hard moments.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Hi.
Hi. First of all, I wanted to say thank you so much for being here and for the work that you do. Your comments about the rise of authoritarianism really resonated with me. I'm a union organizer, so I'm in a different level of the fight against authoritarianism, but we're all in it. And I think, one of the things that I was really thinking about as I was hearing you talk was, as you're talking about how they have a strategy. They are talking to people, they are moving people. They're not just sitting back and saying, hey, authoritarianism is great and we're gonna win because of it. And I think so many people on our side of the fight tend to say, you know what, we're right, and that's enough. Like, it's okay, because we know we're right, and forget that we need to have a strategy too in order to really fight back against what we're up against. We have to be building electoral power. We have to be getting people together. We have to be moving people to action too. So I think the thing that I would love to hear your thoughts on are, where you are in the fight in Florida, where have you seen the most effective organizing happening? Where do you see the most bang for people's buck in terms of people getting together and fighting back against the whole DeSantis craziness? Not just your organization, but I know there are so many others doing the work too. Like, where are you seeing the most success and promise?
Yes, and thank you for pointing that out. The attack on unions is always a function. In fact, parallel polis is a term from the Polish solidarity movement around union organizing. So I'll tell you what has been most effective in Florida. Organizing parents. And by organizing parents, I don't just mean parents who agree. We started a thing called Parenting with Pride, And we said, this is open to any parent. Like, we get phone calls from parents going, look, I don't know where I stand on this issue, but my kid just came out, and I want to get access to good resources. And if that's where they are, we're going to get them access to the best resources. They're not going, I'm ready to go into the school board chamber and, storm the podium and give them, what for. Sometimes it's, I fully support my kid, but there's something going on in the schools where my kid isn't being treated well. I don't call myself an activist, but I'm willing to fight for my kid. If that's where they are, we're going to connect them with another parent who's going to help them with that process, or a staff member. And then there's the parents that show up ready to fight. And they don't, they're just like, point me towards the most effective place to deploy my rage. And now people graduate from one level to the next. But the growth of our parents network has been astonishing. And them showing up in those hearings has been an absolute game changer. In fact, I think it was in Pinellas County, one of the Moms for Liberty leaders said, we're not coming back anymore because Equality Florida and all those parents keep calling us liars. Like, well, there's a cure for that. Stop lying. So it is, I say that it's asymmetrical warfare because we're thinking that our democracy is just unfolding and Barack Obama is president and Hillary Clinton was, and we're just moving forward in this linear way. And you have to understand that there's a reason, like, how did our country go down this QAnon rabbit hole? And conspiracy theory, there's an overlap. It's not just on the far right. There's an overlap of conspiracy theory indoctrination that people from every part of the political spectrum can be drawn into. In fact, they talk about the crunchy right-wing pipeline, that people go from, hey, we like good natural foods that aren't based on chemicals, and suddenly they're on every kind of right-wing, the algorithm begins to draw them into that world. So I say all of this to say we have to break free of the only way we communicate being compartmentalized by Elon Musk's algorithmic interference or Zuckerberg's, and we've got to start talking to each other. There's a great book that I highly recommend called Heather McGee's The Sum of Us, and it talks about the political landscape in America shaped by racism, slavery, but it also talks about how you get people through union organizing to go past their built-in biases to understand and relate, not to think, hey, I might one day be a billionaire, and instead, right now, I have much more to do with this person of a different race, different faith, who works on the other side of the factory from me than I have with these people who I'm idolizing that don't give a damn about me or my family. So union organizing is one of the tools of creating solidarity that helps people understand where their actual allegiances ought to lie. So thank you for raising that.
Thank you.
And I think thank you very much, yes. And we have time for 2 quick questions. Your questions, you go, and then you go.
Everyone once, you go.
Okay.
Hi. So I grew up in Tampa, and I got out. But I still have a lot of family who live here, and I try to talk to them sometimes about, my mother especially is very convinced that, oh golly, if only this Trump guy would get indicted and get put in prison and go away, they're still Republicans, but if Trump would go away, everything would be much better. And yeah, if only. I try to push that, this is the culmination of decades and centuries long of the same old song and dance. And how would you recommend? I don't want to continually get into fights with my parents about this, but
right.
How would you recommend kind of like providing resources or something to show the history of this movement? It's not, it may have, Trump at the forefront now, but if he goes away, it's still the movement. They're
right.
still going forward.
My quick answer is, this is why I spend time revealing machinery that says you weren't thinking about trans people playing sports. You really weren't. And I had a guy who was working on my computer, and he said, listen, I'm pretty good on the gay issue, but I can't get there on the trans issue. And I said, what's your problem? He said, well, the whole pronoun thing, and they're so aggressive about the pronouns. And then sports, I think that whole swimmer situation. And it turns out he's never had any confrontation with anybody about pronouns. I said, I mess up people's pronouns once a week. I've never had anybody rip my head off. The only thing I've had people do is correct me. And we all went on with our lives, right? So your fear about pronouns is kind of like the razor blade and the apple at Halloween. Everybody's heard about it. No one's ever experienced it. The other one, I said, when did you become a fan of women's swimming? Right? Because I want you to understand, I'm not. I mean, I'm into women's sports, but I couldn't have named a single athlete to you until they began banging that drum. And I said, don't you get curious as to how you came to really be upset about this thing that you didn't give a damn about, until that year? And as he began to see the machinery, it became much more about, yeah, actually, I see how I'm getting played here. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a clue in that, because it's not a judgment. It's just about, see how you're being manipulated in these ways. But we can talk more after. Real quick.
Okay, real quick. I work with social services, veterans services specifically, and my office has been calling Kat Comack, our senator, trying to get our governor to stop what he's doing. But whenever the governor sends National Guard to Texas to take care of the border, that is called governor's orders, and if anything were to happen to that person, soldier, it would be covered under workers' compensation. And even though they are soldiers, the VA, if they break an ankle, workers' compensation will get that ankle healed. But 20 years down the road, when he's got arthritis and can't walk, there's nothing the state's going to do about it. Whereas if it's federal orders, then the VA can umbrella that person and any injuries at the time and later in life. And so we've been begging Kat Comack to do something, because we have soldiers who are going and acting as U.S. when they're under state of Florida orders, and only the state of Florida.
Let's talk afterwards, because I haven't seen that story in the media yet.
It's fairly new.
Yeah, and we should definitely talk about it. But the chilling thing everyone should take from that is that our governor basically created his own army.
Correct.
That he can deploy anywhere in the country.
And they have, the federal government has no say and no liability of anything that happens to their soldiers.
And they're doing it along the border. There was an undercover, news team that went there and watched, and they were playing golf and hanging out in their cars because there's nothing for them to do, right? But what they wanted to provoke was federal government troops deployed to challenge the authority of DeSantis's personal army, to spark that moment that they can call for the Oath Keepers and the January 6th insurrectionists to rise up, Waco, to the infinite power. These are the moments they are trying to orchestrate in America to trigger that moment. But I do want you to know this. I thank you very much for that. I just want to remind you that hope is a discipline, and it is rooted in the fact that we have been here before, we have navigated backlash, we have stopped authoritarian push in this country and in other countries through solidarity, for looking out for each other, and those moments became the springboard, the fertile ground from which we envisioned a future and created a future that was better than the one we left. Thank you all.